It's August 23rd, 1940. A young British scientist sits with his wife, watching German bombers tear through the night sky over Birmingham, England. But Reginald Jones isn't watching what he can see. He's watching for something invisible, something that could lose Britain the war. The German Luftwaffe had discovered a secret weapon, not a bomb, not a plane, but something far more dangerous. They had learned to see in the dark, and the British had no idea how they were doing it. In 1940, finding a target at night was nearly impossible. Pilots navigated by what they could see: the ground in daylight, the stars at night. British bombers were so bad at navigation that one RAF crew trying to bomb Holland got lost in a storm and accidentally bombed their own airbase in southern England. The darkness was Britain's shield, but the Germans had cracked it. This is the story of the Battle of the Beams, an invisible war fought in radio waves, where brilliant minds on both sides raced to outsmart each other. One side wielding radio beams that could guide bombers to pinpoint accuracy in total darkness. The other scrambling to bend those beams, jam them, and ultimately break them. And at the center of it all was a 28-year-old physicist who would play one of the greatest practical jokes in military history. September 1939. War breaks out. Reginald Victor Jones, freshly recruited at age 27 into MI6's Scientific Intelligence Division, receives an anonymous report. It came from the British Embassy in Oslo, sent by someone claiming to be a German anti-Nazi. The Oslo report described various Nazi technologies, including one particularly interesting item: a radio system that could measure an aircraft's distance from a transmitter. Jones filed it away. Interesting, but unverified. He needed more. The clues came slowly, piece by piece, like a detective novel written in real time. First came the interrogations. The British had figured out something clever. They bugged the prison cells where captured German pilots were held. An intelligence officer named Dennis Felkin would question them, but he was more interested in what they said to each other when they thought they were alone. One pilot mentioned something called the X device. He told a fellow prisoner, "It has to do with dropping bombs on an unseen target." Jones set to work. A bombing guidance system would likely involve radio technology, the revolutionary field that had captivated young physicists in the 1920s and 30s. Jones himself had been one of those amateur radio enthusiasts, building crystal sets, trying to pick up the most distant signals. But he wasn't the only one. In Germany, another young man had been similarly inspired. Johannes Hans Plendl, born in 1900, son of a Munich grocer. He'd served as a naval wireless operator at the end of World War I. At university, he became obsessed with radio propagation, how radio waves travel through the air. When the Nazis came to power, they saw an air force as crucial to Germany's future. They poured money into research, and Plendl had a question: could radio signals guide a bomber to its target? By the late 1930s, he had an answer. Back in England, Jones kept collecting clues. April 1940. A Spitfire shoots down a German aircraft. In the pilot's pocket is a scrap of paper reading "Radio Beacon Nicobane from 0600 hours on 315 degrees. That was odd. 315 degrees meant northwest. But a plane flying from Germany to Britain would look south or east for a navigational beacon. And navigational beacons don't have fixed bearings. Jones had a theory. What if this beacon wasn't broadcasting in all directions, but sending a signal in one direction only? A radio beam. A plane could fly along one beam, then drop its bombs when it crossed another beam. Depending on how narrow the beams were, this could deliver far greater precision than anything the RAF had. It would work at night, in any weather, but it was just a theory. And the RAF wasn't impressed. They insisted such aids were unnecessary. Real pilots didn't need electronic crutches. Jones needed proof. June 1940. A baffled RAF officer brings Jones a decrypted Luftwaffe message. Cleves Nickebein is confirmed at position 53 degrees, 24 minutes north and 1 degree west. Those were the coordinates of Retford, a town in central England. The RAF had rushed there the day before, hoping to find German spies. They found nothing, but Jones understood immediately. Cleves was one of the closest German towns to Britain. A transmitter there must have been picked up by a Luftwaffe plane over Retford during a test. He went back to Felkin's transcripts. Months earlier, a captured German mechanic had laughed when another prisoner asked about the X device. "They'll never find it out," the mechanic said. "They can try it out and examine it as much as they like. It's a sort of apparatus that they will never find out." Jones misinterpreted this. He thought the mechanic meant the equipment was hidden so cleverly on German planes that the British wouldn't spot it. The mechanic actually meant no one would figure out what it was for. But this misunderstanding would lead Jones to his breakthrough. The British had captured a German Heinkel 111 bomber months earlier. Jones pulled out the report. Listed among the radio equipment, a blind landing receiver. Blind landing systems used 2 transmitters on either side of a runway, broadcasting alternately on the same frequency. A pilot heard short tones if he was left of the runway, long tones if he was right. Lined up with the runway, he heard a solid tone. Effectively, blind landing created a radio beam, but blind landing was short range, maybe 30 miles. Retford was 300 miles from Cleves. Jones called the engineer who'd examined the Heinkel. "Was there anything unusual about the blind landing gear?" "Now you mention it," came the reply. "It is much more sensitive than you would ever need." Eureka! More sensitive receivers, more powerful transmitters. The Germans had taken blind landing technology and supercharged it. They called it Nickebein, German for crooked leg, named for the shape of the massive antennas. Late June 1940, Jones was summoned to 10 Downing Street to brief Winston. Churchill later described hearing that Luftwaffe pilots could navigate in the dark as one of the blackest moments of the war. Britain faced accurate bombing night after night. Until defeat. "What can be done?" Churchill asked. Jones replied, "If we can find the beams, we might be able to jam them." That night, an RAF pilot was sent up to hunt for the beams. He found them quickly. They were aimed at the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, where Britain made the Merlin engines for Spitfires and Hurricanes. "Good, clear signals," he reported. "A beam just 500 yards wide from 300 miles away." The Germans had made a crucial mistake. They'd turned on their system for testing before they were ready to use it. This gave the British precious time. The beams were codenamed Headache. Another young physicist, Robert Cockburn, was given the job of finding a cure. He built transmitters, codenamed Aspirin, that would mimic the beam signals and confuse German pilots. To detect the beams and activate the jammers, the British built a network of monitoring stations. These had a wonderfully improvised quality. Tiny wooden sheds lashed to the top of 300-foot radar masts along the coast. Inside sat former amateur radio enthusiasts with jury-rigged equipment, antenna mounted on broomsticks, listening all night for Nickebein signals. And then, in July 1940, the beams disappeared. Throughout the entire month, no signals could be found. Senior officers who already thought Jones was arrogant began questioning whether the whole beam scare had been overblown. But the Luftwaffe had simply turned off their system until they were ready to use it in earnest. And this gave Cockburn desperately needed time to perfect his countermeasures. Mid-August 1940, the German bombing campaign against Britain begins. Cockburn's aspirins are waiting. He also deployed devices called meacons, receivers that picked up broadcasts from Germany's ordinary navigational beacons and retransmitted them on the same frequency. Confusing German navigation equipment. German air crews discovered their navigation beacons were acting strangely. Sometimes the signals were strong, but coming from the wrong direction. Sometimes the beacons seemed to be moving. As for Nicobine, it simply wasn't working right. Sometimes crews couldn't pick up the signal. Sometimes they found it, but it didn't take them where it should. A rumor began spreading through the Luftwaffe. The British had somehow learned to bend radio beams, but Jones had made a critical error. He thought Nicobine and the X device were the same thing. They weren't. The Luftwaffe was operating two separate beam navigation systems, and while the British were successfully jamming Nicobine, the more sophisticated X device was working perfectly. An elite German bomber unit, Kampfgruppe 100, called themselves the Vikings. They'd been training with the X device since the start of the war, and now operated from northern France. They were setting England on fire. August 1940. KGR 100 dropped 156 tons of bombs. Only 2 members were injured. Only 1 plane reported damage from enemy fire. Jones watched them bomb Birmingham that August night and knew something was wrong. September 1940. Jones pieced together more clues. The RAF assigned the X device its own code name, Ruffian. Cockburn was told to develop more powerful jammers. Bromide. By month's end, Jones reached a dispiriting conclusion. The X device could place a bomber within 20 yards over London. If German radio technology was that good, could Britain defeat it? In October, bromide jammers began operating, but decrypted Luftwaffe messages showed no complaints from pilots. The X device was still working. Jones now understood how it operated. While Nicobine used 1 beam with a crossing beam, Plendel's X device used 3 crossing beams. The pilot flew at a fixed altitude. Crossing the first beam was an alert. At the second beam, the radio operator pressed a button, starting a clock. At the third beam, another button started a countdown. The device was effectively an onboard computer that calculated the plane's speed and factored in altitude to determine the perfect moment to drop bombs. The Luftwaffe gave the Vikings a new role: pathfinders. They would fly ahead of the main force, dropping incendiaries to mark targets for others to bomb visually. November 14, 1940. The Vikings climbed into their Heinkels. The night was so clear they could see the countryside below by moonlight. Just after 7 p.m., after 90 minutes flying, they dropped their bombs on the city of Coventry and turned for home. Nearly 500 German bombers followed, using the fires as their guide. Crews crossing the channel in the middle of the night saw what looked like a flashlight ahead. Getting closer, they realized it was Coventry, burning so brightly it could be seen from 100 miles away. They could smell the fire. They could feel the heat from the flames. Jones was appalled by the destruction, but also baffled. The pathfinders had passed within miles of 2 bromide transmitters. It should have worked. Then came a stroke of luck. A KGR 100 bomber, its crew hopelessly confused by British jamming of navigational beacons, ran out of fuel. They landed on what they thought was a French beach. It was England. The tide came in while the Army and Navy argued over who had the right to capture something on a beach. By the time Jones got it, the X device was waterlogged. But it was intact. German radio technology was more advanced than British. Cockburn's jamming signals had been using the wrong tone, 500 Hz instead of 2000 Hz. The German equipment had filtered out the British interference. It was a problem that could be fixed. But there was a third system. Jones had learned of something called the Y device, sometimes referred to as Wotan. He asked a German-language specialist at Bletchley Park about the name. Wotan referred to Woden, a one-eyed god. Jones theorized it might be a one-beam system. He was right. The Y device was Plendel's newest creation. A bomber would find the beam and engage autopilot to stay on course. An operator on the ground, tracking the plane, would transmit a signal to release bombs at the right moment. But here, Jones had already prepared. The Y device operated at 45 mm parameters, the same frequency as the BBC's television transmitter at Alexandra Palace, shut down since the start of the war. Cockburn commandeered the BBC transmitter. When German planes sent their return signals, the British received them and retransmitted them from Alexandra Palace. The combination modified the phase shift, corrupting the distance measurements. Initially, they transmitted at low power, not enough for the Germans to realize what was happening, but enough to spoil the system's accuracy. Over subsequent nights, they gradually increased power. The Y device started malfunctioning. German aircrew accused ground stations of sending bad signals. Ground stations blamed loose connections in the aircraft. No one realized the British were behind it. The gradually increasing power conditioned the Germans to think the system had inherent defects. Eventually, as power increased enough, the whole Y device system started ringing with feedback. Jones later remarked that he'd been able to play one of the largest practical jokes in history with virtually any national resource he required. By February 1941, the Battle of the Beams was essentially won. The Luftwaffe had completely lost faith in electronic navigation over Britain, and Hitler's attention was turning east toward the Soviet Union. In May 1941, KGR-100 was losing about one plane per night. The RAF now had airborne radar. Night bombing was no longer safe work. July 1941, KGR-100 was moved to Poland, in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Battle of the Beams was an invisible war where brilliance mattered more than firepower. Jones's early identification of Koninklijke and the realization that German navigation beacons were a threat ensured that most of the Luftwaffe struggled to navigate over Britain. Churchill called Jones the man who broke the bloody beam. Plendl wasn't blamed for the Luftwaffe's failure. He kept his position. After the war, Operation Paperclip brought him to America. What the Americans discovered. During the war, Plendl had used his position to save Jewish scientists from death camps, insisting he needed their help. Among those he protected was Hans Meyer, the author of the Oslo Report that had helped Jones crack Plendl's beams. Two brilliant minds on opposite sides, one trying to guide bombers to their targets, the other trying to lead them astray, and in between, an invisible network of radio waves that could have changed the outcome of the war. The crazy idea of bending, jamming, and ultimately breaking Germany's hidden network didn't just work. It helped save Britain.